Thanks a lot. Can everyone hear me okay? Yep. Okay, hearing no objections, I'll get started. Yeah, so like Trish said, my name is Chris Gusen. Um, I have worked for over 10 years in public sector communications. This is kind of a map of what I'm going to talk through this afternoon, hoping to keep it to around half an hour so we have lots of time for discussion and questions afterwards. So I'll talk a little bit about my story. Then I'll talk about where I see the climate emergency as relevant to crisis communications. We'll get a little bit more into the science in part three. Um, Part four, we'll just briefly touch on some of the psychology of why we're still not acting as a society to address the climate emergency. Kind of builds on some of what we heard in the last talk about psychology and science. And then finally, I'll have some calls to action, what you can do if you're inspired by what you hear. So I've worked in the public sector communications my whole career. I started out as a marketing manager at the Rotman School of Management at U of T. For 3 years, I worked for Edmonton Economic Development Corporation on an initiative called Make Something Edmonton, which was an award-winning place branding initiative. You might have heard of it if you work and live around the Edmonton area. Um, and most recently, I worked for 2 years as a senior executive in communications and public engagement at the government of Alberta. That's where I was responsible for branding and visual communications, and I managed the government's central design services team. So working at the government of Alberta was really the first time that I experienced crisis communications and all of that really interesting work that goes into preparing, planning, working through scenarios. This is a picture some of you may recognize of the provincial operations center. So I went to some trainings there, learned about all the different colored vests and what they mean, and um, how how pre-planning is so important to keeping a cool head during a crisis. So I helped to coordinate emergency communications for major wildfires like the ones that took place in Waterton Lakes area in 2017. It was really an all hands on deck kind of situation during those moments. So I was responsible for organizing telephone town halls, which allowed for direct communication between government officials and the public, creating visual communications templates and kits, and setting up the standards for social media communications and graphics during emergency situations. Um, like many of my colleagues, I received this training at the POC, and it really is an amazing place. Um, as you all probably know, communicating during a crisis is stressful and exhausting, uh, but it's also some of the most meaningful work that I've ever done as a public servant. Sometimes in government, especially on the communications side, it can be hard to see how you're helping people, but in emergency situations, it's really unambiguous. And a lot of my colleagues felt the same way. When I talked to them about um, the work that they did, they pointed to moments of crisis where they can provide clarity and guidance to the public, life-saving information in many cases. They pointed to those moments as some of the most important in their careers. This is a mantra that uh, my boss and all of us in the organization kind of repeated. The public has a right to know, government has a duty to tell them. And of course, in a crisis, this really holds true. Accuracy, transparency, speed of information can be life-saving. And this is really what government communication is at its best, a real public service, helping the public to understand complex issues and to make informed choices. And I tried to apply that to my thinking about how we sort of streamlined and modernized the branding and visual communication style of the government of Alberta just to make it clear, transparent, all of those good things. Now, where does climate change come into all of this? So I've known about climate change for as long as I can remember. I'm sure many of you are the same. I've always known that it was something that we needed to do our part to mitigate. So throughout my 20s, I tried to do the green thing as an individual. So you can see some bikes behind me. So I love biking. I do that as much as possible instead of driving. I also Sorry, one second. I also eat a plant-based diet, and I recycle. I do all of those sort of individual things that we're told um, will help. But over the last couple of years, it's become clear to me that individual action isn't is necessary, but it's not sufficient for us to avoid outright climate catastrophe. That's what has led me down the path towards climate justice, activism, and organizing. So I'm not sure how many people are familiar with this report that I've got the headline up from. But in 2018, the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the world's foremost climate science body, issued a stark warning saying that we had 12 years left. It's just this really rapidly closing window to stop the world from warming over 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. It's already at 1 degree. And the report really got into detail about the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees of warming. It seems like a really small number, but it's a critical number. And it means the difference between life and death for many people. It means significantly more extreme weather, drought, floods, poverty. It's something that we want to avoid. We want to try to keep under 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's what the Paris Agreement was about. And of course, that was 2018. And IPCC is known to be conservative in its estimates. Reality has consistently outpaced their predictions. So having a stark deadline was one thing that helped to wake me up, sort of this sense of fear. And that's something that I think climate communications has avoided traditionally, always wanting to emphasize solutions and hope, which is a good thing. But this sense of urgency worked on me, and it worked on a lot of other people. I've met people who've become involved in climate activism, in big part because of this report, which is sort of a watershed moment. Um, Another thing that motivated me to become involved was a sense of compassion. I don't have kids myself, but I have a lot of kids in my life, and obviously, I'm a human being. I think all of us care about future generations. So I was struck by the youth movement that was growing around the world. So over the last couple of years, as you've probably noticed, more and more young people are striking on Fridays, leaving school, going to protests, and issuing demands for adults to do something about the climate crisis, which is so clearly a threat to their futures and all of our futures. So sense of solidarity with people who are younger than me motivated me to act as well. And also, this is a little bit selfish, but I think it's very relevant, and I think maybe it can help you think about this too. Um, Putting things into the context of my own lifetime. I'm going to be 38 in 2025. According to current projections, we'll be at 1.5 C by then. If we go on our follow current policies and paths, that means unprecedented crop failures, migration, conflict. Um, we, if we don't change things fast, we'll hit 2 degrees by 2035, and I'll be 48. I'll still be working. Um, and again, if we let things get away from us, we're looking at 4 to 6 degrees of warming by 2075, and that's 4 degrees is not the Earth's not going to be able to support human civilization. At 6 degrees, it's barely going to be habitable for life. So that idea that climate change is a far away thing and it's a problem for future generations really is being demolished. The climate emergency is here, and you can actually map the current projections to your own lifespan. I think that really drives things home. And so I started to take it seriously when Greta Thunberg said, "I want you to act as if your house is on fire," because it is. I thought to myself, what does that look like? Um, and I began to experience pretty significant cognitive dissonance. So, like I said before, uh, as public service communicators, we claimed that we abide by this mantra: the public has a right to know, and we have a duty to tell them. But I was rarely given an opportunity in my job to communicate about the climate crisis, which is the most significant crisis of our time. Almost no one talked about it at the office either. It almost felt like a taboo. So maybe think about how often you talk to your colleagues about climate change. I think there's a real cultural taboo starting to be broken, but especially in Alberta, where we owe a lot to the oil and gas industry and a lot of people have affection for it, it feels almost sacrilegious to talk about climate change. So I remember going into a meeting room with some colleagues and closing the door for a secret conversation about the fact that I don't support pipelines, and I think that expanding the fossil fuel industry during a climate emergency is a bad idea. So we, felt the need to close the door, sort of have a hush-hush conversation about that. And if I had stuck around in that job, I wasn't compelled, I wasn't forced out or anything like that. It was my decision to leave. If I'd stuck around, though, I would have been working on communications products for a government that tolerates climate denial in its caucus and is very, very milquetoast in its climate action, borderline denialist, I would say. Um, so I quit last June, and I pretty quickly got involved in a few different climate organizations here in Edmonton. So this is a picture of me helping out with one of the big climate marches that happened this past fall. Um, and it's a really a joyful feeling, as you can see on my face, to be with other people who feel this, and the mobilizations, the protests this past fall were some of the biggest that Edmonton has seen in decades since the Iraq War protests. Last summer, I was also involved in a campaign called Our Time, OUR, which worked to raise climate change as a key election issue. So here we are outside CBC headquarters in Edmonton. We really wanted to pressure them as our public broadcaster to host a debate specifically on climate change, climate policy. They didn't do it, but we still managed to raise climate change as an issue, and it became the second or first polling election issue on people's minds. So it really is having this moment where people are waking up to it. I also got involved in more traditional advocacy, organizing people to show up at City Hall for meetings on energy transition, climate action, and the climate emergency declaration that Edmonton City Council made last August. This is a photo from that meeting. And I was able to put my training to work, so helping different organizations with media relations, being able to just jump into a scrum to speak on behalf of the community and civil society when needed. So it was nice to be able to apply my skills. And if you're listening to this and you feel compelled to get more involved, know that these organizations really appreciate the work of communicators, and your skills will be really valuable. I also helped to shift an organization that I've been involved with for many years called The Local Good, to be more vocal about climate change and the fact that it is an emergency. So we have just wrapped up a season of networking events on different themes related to the climate emergency, getting people to, again, break that taboo, break that silence, and talk about what needs to be done. And with an organization called Extinction Rebellion, I participated in some nonviolent civil disobedience. Some of you may be familiar with the protest that happened on the Walterdale Bridge last fall. I'll get into more detail later about why I believe that kind of action is justified, and in fact, a very necessary tactic to communicate the urgency of the climate emergency. So that's a little bit about me. Now, it should be fairly obvious, I think, but I wanted to get a little bit into why this is relevant to crisis communications, why it's relevant to you as professional crisis communicators or people who work in government and public service. So like I said, the climate emergency is already here. The world has already warmed 1 degree above pre-industrial levels, and we're already seeing unprecedented extreme weather as a result. like the fires in Australia in January. I know it seems like it was years ago, but that was just this year. So it's not a problem for future generations. It's a problem for us. Um, it's also not a flash in the pan moment that we're going to solve. It is going to define the rest of our lives. Um, Even if we were to wave a magic wand and stop CO2 emissions today, we would still see more warming because there's a lag in the effect of carbon in the atmosphere. And there are also feedback loops. We are in for an era, our entire lives will be defined by this. It's a threat multiplier. So it increases the likelihood of extreme weather events, increases the extremity of those events. Um, and socioeconomic models for our future climate pathways also account for things like human conflict increases with temperature rise and resource scarcity. So it's not just going to cause extreme weather, flooding, sea level rise. It's also going to put pressure on all of our institutions and our civilization. And this sort of builds on what the last speaker was talking about. Crises don't line up in a neat queue and wait their turn. So as you probably know, this wildfire season is expected to be above average across Canada. Um, and that, of course, is happening during a pandemic. So um, add wildfire, high chance of extreme wildfire to the triadic crises that we were talking about in the last presentation. Another example is in Philadelphia right now. They're experiencing COVID-19, protests and military occupation, and now tornado warnings that are driven by climate. So we are in an era of overlapping crises that we need to plan for. Climate change is non-linear. So humans are really bad at wrapping our heads around non-linear change. Carbon emissions haven't just been increasing, they've been increasing exponentially. And changes to our climate and ecological systems will be non-linear and abrupt. It's similar to COVID-19 in that way. That's why scientists are telling us that it's a critical decade. The 2020s are the critical window for climate action. We have to flatten the climate curve, just like we are trying to flatten the COVID-19 curve. So this is an interesting article talking about the idea climate change seems low risk. It doesn't feel dangerous until it isn't. It's because it's nonlinear, and humans are bad at thinking about that. So you could, in a linear world, you can have phenomena that are constant high risk, constant low risk, but climate and COVID are both on nonlinear curves. And so it takes a long time for us to actually feel the impacts. And by the time we do feel the extreme impacts, it may be too late. Just another visualization of the same thing, nonlinear growth. It's a scary thing. So now is the critical moment to flatten the curve, like I said. And so here's an example of that curve. So these are different pathways to a 1.5 degree world. Or actually, in this case, we're talking about limiting to 2 degrees Celsius, which is worse than 1.5, but still survivable. So if we had peak carbon emissions in 1995, it would have been a much gentler curve. And now with every moment that passes, the curve becomes steeper and starts to look more and more like a cliff. So it becomes more and more difficult to imagine how we can manage a transition to a low carbon world. But that's what scientists say we need to do. And so that's why, it's so important that we all start talking about this and thinking about this more. But this is not like normal crisis communications. So if you're dealing with a pandemic or a wildfire, politicians, with the exception of Trump, usually listen to the experts, let the experts speak for themselves, and they put the protection of human life above everything else, at least in theory. But with climate change, powerful interests and cultural forces still stand in the way of an appropriate response. This is especially apparent in Alberta, where the fossil fuel industry has captured government, it's captured regulators, and it's captured the public imagination. So it's incredibly important that in Alberta we reckon with this and we think about what our future will look like as we transition and tackle the climate emergency along with the rest of the international community. But we have a lot of obstacles in our way, and it's very difficult to, even now, to talk about it. So it's important that all of us see ourselves as part of this struggle. So hopefully I've convinced you that this is relevant to crisis communicators. Again, I think this is going to define your work as crisis communicators. Everything, uh, everything is connected to climate change. It's a thing that all of us should be thinking about more. Um, but maybe you're wondering, like, is it really that bad? Um, so here's a quote from UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres back in 2018. Climate change is quite simply an existential threat for most life on the planet, including and especially the life of humankind. Guterres has also gone on the record saying that we need radical change to transport systems, to industry, to basically everything about our way of life. So if a conservative body like the UN is calling for radical change, you know it's serious. This is a visualization called the climate stripes. I find it really useful. What it does is the colors blue and red show whether a year starting in the 1900 and going all the way up to this last year 2019 on the far right, if a year was above average temperature or below. So darker blue is well below average, dark red is well above average. The past 6 years have been the hottest on record globally. So, you know, we are climbing up that exponential curve. And we know that 4 of the Earth's 5 previous mass extinctions were largely driven by CO2. And right now, CO2 is rising 10 times faster than at any time in the last 66 million years. And we're already seeing increased rates of extinction. So we are in the 6th mass extinction already. Wildlife has declined 60% in the last 50 years. And this is an article from just yesterday saying that the mass extinction is accelerating. This is a pretty frightening headline. If you look at the lead, it's saying that this may be a tipping point for the collapse of civilization. So again, why is this something that our political leaders are not talking about every single day? Why are we not in crisis communications mode about the climate emergency when it's this dire and scientists are warning? And I would say a large part of that is because people think in short-term cycles, especially politicians, and there's so much influence still from the fossil fuel industry, which is resistant to anything that will cut into their bottom line. Even though we're in the 6th mass extinction and we know what's going on, carbon emissions are up 60% since 1990. So the past 30 years, we've seen the largest increase of carbon in the atmosphere since humanity came into existence. And that's when we've known the most about it, and that's when we've been raising the alarm the most about it. So we've had 30 years of traditional climate communications, traditional campaigning, petitions, protests, stunts, you name it, fundraising. People have been sounding the alarm, and there's been great work done. City of Edmonton has a great initiative called Change for Climate that I think is excellent. But it's not going far enough because this curve is still rising. That's the only thing that matters. In 2015, the world ratified the Paris Climate Agreement. They said they wanted to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. 1.5 still means that 70 to 90% of coral reefs are gone. It still means massive dead zones in the ocean, die-offs of wildlife, and food shortages for humans. It also means an increase in extreme weather, floods, wildfires, invasive species, changes to our natural environment. At 2 degrees, agricultural yields are significantly less bountiful. Flooding, hurricanes, wildfires are even worse. For example, in California, in a 2-degree scenario, they expect at least 4 times as many wildfires. Canada is warming even faster than the global average because of our northern latitude. Um, at 2 degrees Celsius, there's expected to be a 15 fold spike in climate refugees. So if you think about the Syrian refugee crisis, that was 1 million people. Um, so climate models are predicting 200 million people displaced by climate change by the year 2050, which is within my lifetime and probably many of the people on this call. Um, but after 4 years, it's now been over 4 years since the Paris Agreement was signed. Many countries are not keeping up with their pledges. Um, and as you can see in this chart here, current climate policies have us hitting between 3.1 and 3.7 degrees. Who knows what will happen with tipping points? There's also the possibility of a 4-degree world, and there's no rule that says we couldn't go past that. So what happens at 4 degrees of global warming? Global GDP is 20 to 30% less than without climate change. So that's twice as deep as the Great Depression, and that's a permanent change. That's not a recession that we bounce back from. $600 trillion in global climate damages, which is twice as much wealth as exists in the world today. Um, in a 4-degree scenario, parts of the planet would be hit by 6 climate-driven natural disasters at once. So you'd have 6-fold crises driven by climate. And like I alluded to earlier, there would be twice as much war because there's a relationship between temperature and conflict. Under a 4-degree world, dengue fever and malaria would be as far north as the Arctic Circle. So basically everything we know about modern life, political life, cultural life, it'll all be scrambled by these forces. And like I said, IPCC has continually been shown to be conservative. So we really need to have a sense of urgency and flatten the curve of climate as soon as possible. So there are some researchers who say that there's a 1 in 20 chance, a 5% chance, um, that we trigger runaway climate change, even at 1.5 degrees. And that would just mean, for example, the permafrost in the Arctic would melt and release even more methane, which is a highly potent greenhouse gas. And then we would just have a scenario where we can't control acceleration in global warming. 1 in 20 doesn't sound like a lot, but think about a scenario where you are about to board a plane and the pilot tells you there's a 1 in 20 chance that it would crash. Or you're about to send your kids or your grandkids on a plane, and the pilot tells you there's a 1 in 20 chance that it will crash. You would not board that plane. You would not send your kids on that plane. So that's what we're talking about with climate change. And it's, again, shocking that we don't talk about it more as a society, although that is beginning to change. So that's the science. It's a good time to take a breath. If this has made you angry or anxious or skeptical or whatever emotions you might be feeling right now, it's pretty heavy stuff. And I certainly went through a process of coming to terms with how bad it is. But that is also where I get my motivation from, is, you know, a sense of urgency and fellowship with everyone on this planet. It's understandable if you haven't thought about this a lot already, or if you've dismissed it. So we talked a little bit in the previous lecture about science behind how people think about disasters and how people come to terms with the disasters. So going through sort of a denial phase. So with climate change, we use every psychological defense in the book. Some people deny it. Some people intellectualize it. It's real, but I don't feel anything about it. Some people have willful ignorance. I don't want to know what's going on. It's too scary. I've felt that, and I've talked to lots of people who feel that. Or wishful thinking. It can't be that bad. There's no way it's that bad. Regression. We need the experts to handle this. I don't have to think about it. There has to be some professionals who are working on this. We have to be okay. The reason I got involved in climate activism is because I got pretty high up in my career, and I was in, you know, boardrooms with professionals and experts and people who supposedly should be thinking about this stuff, and I didn't hear it being talked about. Rationalization. Oh, I can't do anything meaningful, so I'm not going to think about it or worry about it. Compartmentalization. It's not relevant to me feeling like a good moral person. So like, it doesn't have anything to do with how I feel about myself. Projection. It's happening, but it's other people's fault and responsibility. That's a big part of the rhetoric in Alberta. Talk to China. Go fly to China and protest there. Disassociation. I'm going to zone out or numb myself with substances, video games, other distractions, even work. We're also busy with work, one deadline to the next. For me, as someone who's a bit of a workaholic, seeing that big looming deadline of 12 years to slash carbon emissions in half, that shook me out of my disassociation and distraction. So it's understandable if you haven't thought a lot about this before, but it's important that you do. So finally, let's talk about what you can do. So again, we're living through the biggest crisis that humanity has ever faced. The fact that we're alive right now, it's an amazing time to be alive, but it's also horrifying. It also gives us enormous responsibility because every passing day has exponential potential for impact. There's never any too late with climate change. Every day matters. Every fraction of a degree of warming matters for saving lives and protecting the future. It's not like any other crisis. It's on a global scale. It's an existential threat, and it amplifies existing injustices. So that's why I call myself a climate justice organizer, and that's why the climate movement really centers this idea of climate justice. The poorest people, the people who have the least responsibility for causing climate change, are going to suffer first and worst. And so it's important that we think about that and we make sure that we act to protect everyone. So first piece of advice is that it's time to pick a side. So you can't use your job as an excuse to stay neutral anymore. It's very common in public service to say, okay, well, that's the political side. Like, we have to keep a division between public service and political. And that's important. But everyone has to pick a side now. We're talking about an existential threat to humanity. So if you stay quiet about it because you don't want to ruffle feathers, you are choosing the side of climate denial. You're choosing the side of delay. Again, if there was a wildfire and a politician was saying, oh, let's just ignore it, you wouldn't tolerate that. You'd speak up. It's important that you break the silence. It's really hard to do. And again, I'm speaking as someone who chose to leave rather than to stick around and try to have conversations with my colleagues. But I'm trying to break the silence in different ways through protest and other actions and organizing. But I will tell you that, and you tell me if this sounds familiar when we have our discussion after, when we started to move the local good to be more vocal about climate change, we had people who left the board because they felt it would put their job in jeopardy. And I have friends who are young professionals in Edmonton who have been told by their bosses not to talk about climate change because it's too political. So there is a taboo and there's a silence that we need to work together on breaking. All hope is not lost. There are real science-based solutions. The one that I spend a lot of time advocating for is a Green New Deal. And it's exciting because it's not just about saying no pipelines, no more fossil fuel expansion. It's about saying yes to a transition away from fossil fuels that protects workers, creates really good jobs for people, makes our cities better. There's a positive vision, and I think that people really respond to that, and people are motivated by that. And so there are lots of resources if you'd like to educate yourselves about things like the Green New Deal. One of the organizations that I'm with, Climate Justice Edmonton, we have a webinar series that we gave recently, and so I can share a link to that on YouTube afterwards. We're actually having another webinar this evening on the idea of a just recovery. So how do we recover from COVID-19 in a way that is just? And again, the solutions have to be bold. This curve is equivalent to 7 or 8% reduction in CO2 emissions per year for every year for the next decade. Um, COVID-19 has, because it's shut down so much and kept everyone inside and reduced driving, it has reduced global emissions, but only by 5%. And it hasn't been very fun for anyone either. So there's huge industries that are causing CO2 emissions that haven't really changed because of COVID-19. It's not, and we don't, of course, we don't want to wait for a global pandemic and mass death in order to reduce emissions. There are good ways of doing this. Um, but it has to be ambitious. So if you think about just how much your life has changed because of COVID, um, even that has only caused a 5% reduction. So we need bold solutions, not incrementalism. We need to get comfortable with the idea that in order to avoid these catastrophic scenarios, we're going to have to throw some money at the problem and invest. Um, I also urge you to get involved in collective action. There's a scholar named Erica Chenoweth who has researched social movements throughout history. And what she found was that um, once you don't need a majority of people to be actively involved in a social movement to make radical change. So um, Erica Chenoweth found that once movements get 3.5% of a population actively involved, so going to protests, marching in the streets, talking to people, creating that sense of urgency, they can create huge change. So she studied things like the women's suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, stuff like that. And nonviolent, peaceful protest movements are far more likely to succeed than violence. And of course, that's preferable because you have the moral high ground. Um, and so that's why movements like Extinction Rebellion are causing disruption and people are getting arrested in the thousands. You don't have to be special to do this. But the sacrifice of putting yourself on the line really helps to communicate the urgency like nothing else. So here's a scientist getting arrested. Here's an 80-something-year-old man who was involved in an Extinction Rebellion protest in the UK and was arrested. This person is motivated by their faith. Really, people from all different backgrounds and walks of life are starting to wake up to how bad the climate emergency is, and nonviolent direct action, civil disobedience, is an effective communications tactic for getting the kind of change that we need. If that's not up your alley, or if you're not quite there yet, you should talk to your friends and family about the climate emergency. So studies show that if you're going to change someone's mind, the messenger is key, and there's no messenger more trustworthy than a relative or a close friend. And especially true if you're trying to confront someone's pre-existing beliefs or denial. People on this call probably have resources, so I can tell you that I've been involved for a year now. I have seen no evidence that the climate movement is funded by shady, backroom organizations, the Tides Foundation, etc. We are just a bunch of people who are concerned and are putting our spare time into this. So we need money. I can share some donation links afterwards if people are interested. Donate your time if you can, and your skills. Like I said, communications professionals are needed. If you've ever looked at a protest action and thought, oh, why did they choose that message, or why are they doing it that way? Come to a meeting, start getting involved, help shape what we're doing. So those are some things that you can do. Went a little bit over time, but it looks like we still have a good amount of time for conversation, questions, and discussion. And if you'd like to reach out, that's my Twitter handle, my email address. I've also listed the 3 main organizations that I'm involved with here in Edmonton. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Chris, for that wealth of information that you've shared, and an important reminder of how much more attention we have to put towards this. I think one of the biggest takeaways is that the climate crisis, if it's not already, it will become the majority of a communicator's role moving forward. So we have a question. I'll read it out so that everyone can hear it and then let you answer it, Chris. So, what is our role as crisis communicators? We follow the direction of our leadership when it comes to messaging, and it's our organization's leadership wants to ignore the climate emergency. What can we really do? Is our only option advocating for a response outside of our jobs?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. It's really hard to make change from the inside, especially that division between like the political side and the public service. Um, but it also there needs to be a tipping point. So yeah, again, I don't know exactly how to engineer this. Maybe other people have thoughts, but I believe that as a human being, if you accept, you're all educated, you all can understand the science. So if you see that millions and billions of people are at risk, our future is at risk, you have a moral obligation to do something, and it's not about recycling. It's not about biking. It's not about reducing your own personal impact. So if you feel comfortable talking to your boss more about it, you should. You should talk to your coworkers about it, and there's many examples of people advocating within organizations. In the tech sector, for example, there's a coalition of Amazon workers who pushed Amazon to make an outright pledge to reduce emissions, although they could go further. Same is happening in many companies in the private sector. Um, yeah, but I struggle with that. It's tough. I couldn't stomach staying in the provincial government with the current government in charge because I don't think they take climate change nearly seriously enough. So I think pushing from the outside is helpful too. Um, yeah, perhaps the person who asked that question has some ideas, or maybe someone else wants to chime in. Um, think about giving us money too.
I might chime in just because you were saying that when we speak to our friends and families about things, that it's a trusted person, that there is a role, especially as communicators inside of an organization. If you know that you're one of those trusted experts within the organization, there's an opportunity, and it might not be, you know, outright advocacy work within your job, but there's an opportunity to have an ongoing conversation, and even doing smaller things, um, you know, employee communications. So it might not be that it's this big external campaign, but you can work with the organization to say, like, can we share some of this information internally as a library or something, right? Um, I don't know. That's one way that you can do it without losing your job, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point about the trusted advisor role. Communicators, in a sense, I think that's more true. It's more true of communicators than say specialists like an engineer or an IT person. Communicators really touch so many aspects of the organization, and they often like sit up high up in the organization, depending on where you are in the ladder. So you do have an opportunity to be purview to a lot of conversations. It's tricky though, right? Because I think like the attitude and mindset of crisis communications is let's plan for eventualities. Let's think about what might happen, and then we'll be ready to respond when something does happen. But with climate change, you have to wrap your head around the fact that we are in the emergency now. It just doesn't always feel that way. And the emergency will persist for our entire lives. It's an era that we have now entered, right? So yeah, so you're going to be, as crisis communicators, responding to climate-driven events. You're going to be like wildfires and floods. You're going to be dealing with overlapping crises that are fueled by climate change, so like pandemics with wildfires thrown in the mix. But at what point is the profession? At what point are people, are white collar people, going to answer that call from youth who are saying, "We need your help"? At what point are you going to break out of your comfort zone and say, "No, it's not. It's not okay for us to be silent about this"?
I think that there's a parallel event happening right now that we can sort of extrapolate some of the same actions that can be taken when we look at what's happening. And I know that this is something that's really big in the climate crisis, climate action groups, is that it is a social justice issue. And when we're looking at what's happening, even with racism boiling over right now and bubbling up. That's an issue that and an emergency that we've always been in. It's not something that's in the future that we could have planned for, but something certainly that we need to respond to immediately as individuals and organizations. So I think you can kind of make a parallel plan, as it were, around that as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Chris. I really appreciate you making the time and coming here and sharing the information that you have and the groups that you're a part of. Um, I know that we had a chance to briefly meet a few months ago, and I've been following along, and I'm really excited to be a part of some of these groups, and I feel energized by some of the actions that have been taken, and I appreciate all of the energy and the bravery that it takes to do this work, especially in Alberta. So thank you.